All right. We are live. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm your host, Jason Brand, the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And please join me in giving a special welcome to our guest of honor here today, our Director of Transportation, Robert Lally.
Yay!
I was gonna go woo, so that was literally perfect. Now, if you do any sort of domestic shipping with us, I'm 100% positive you have talked to Bob Lally, and I am positive you also appreciate his way of being very thorough and breaking down your operation and making sure it's a really good fit for us here at SCS. So, big thanks for being back on the show with us today, Bob. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit about what's happening in the trucking market because, as we both know, with the tariffs, I feel like international has just taken over the center stage right now.
And it has, but I think the impact on the slowdown of imports is also going to trickle in and impact the trucking market long term.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get into the details of the past quarter that we've experienced, the ups and downs. So however you want to progress here, Jason, do you want to?
Hey, that's perfect.
We just want to talk about generalities here.
Yeah, honestly, we're going to do a little bit of both. And what I think first kind of thing, rules, there's obviously politics smeared all over these topics. We're going to try our very best at keeping it out of it. But obviously, when a tariff is put on Canada and Mexico, it directly affects us in the trucking realm. And the way it's put on can be kind of extra of an effect. So we're going to keep our best, though, to stay on point with what's happening with the trucking market now, how it has kind of been affected by these tariffs, and going forward. But why don't you start off with exactly what you were saying? Kind of talk about what we've been seeing over the past quarter, just in the market in general.
Well, yeah, from examples from our clientele, we have a client that does a lot of flatbed moves in the Southeast. And they originate out of the Atlanta area, and that market in particular has had the highest load to truck ratio for all modes, flatbed, reefer, van, than any other region in the country. And a lot of it to do with the flatbed piece. There's a lot of lumber, steel, you have some produce down there, some other manufacturing that demands flatbed, concrete, that kind of thing. And so the market that we experienced, the flatbeds, let's say on average, we're probably paying $200 more a load than we did at the end of the last year, right now to secure capacity. And it's gotten a little better, but 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, even a month ago, we were struggling to find capacity to move loads, especially for anything, going to Florida out of Georgia, which is never really an attractive lane. But we saw just to get interest, the rates were up, $200 to $300. And also, so with that, you had the flight of people trying to get product from Mexico into the United States, right, with all the tariff rattling. So that drove the cross border out of Laredo. That the capacity there is super tight. So loads coming out of Mexico into the U.S., trying to get ahead of it, trying to buffer. A little bit of that in Canada too. Since the pause, things have calmed down a little bit. I mean, it's still very tight in the border, Laredo, McAllen area of Texas. And the Canadian border, not so much. I think that's kind of neutral right now. I think the inbound from Canada into the U.S., from what we see and what we read, is it's really starting to take a pause based on what's going on with the tariff there. But so yeah, I mean, with a lack of product coming in from China into the ports or from other areas, that's going to trickle down and slow down, because eventually it gets on a truck at some point.
Yeah. And that's just a bunch of supply that's going to be missing for a little bit as we go through these, tariff negotiation situation. I got a question for you. So you kind of talked about how the load to truck ratio is at a recent, and actually more than a pretty relatively longer period of time high. Give us some insight as to like what we're looking at, like loads to truck right now in some of the southeastern areas of the United States?
Well, for flatbeds in particular, it's like 40 loads to one truck.
It's crazy. And
So,
but like $200 more, that almost feels like still you're getting this at a discount given the demand, right?
well, yeah. And so if we go back and we look at where spot rates for the truckload market were through 2024, I guess we could say we were in a recession, right? We were bumbling and bouncing around the bottom, thinking, is this it? Is this it throughout the year? Which, rates were lower than the previous year because so much capacity was out there. And so starting the year, we saw a little uptick. There started to be, before the tariff rattling, before everything kind of hit, there was an uptick in activity. So we saw a little pressure on rates going up, more demand out there. And then when the tariff hit, it just became, kind of a regional thing based on where you needed to move the load. But then, early on, there was some in the Midwest piece, with some of the cross-border traffic with Canada that was impacted. But yeah, I mean, I read a report where the flatbed rates were the highest in the first quarter since 2017.
What?
Oh,
seriously?
Yeah, the rates.
Wow.
So it gives you a little historical perspective where the rates went, and they're, throughout the first quarter with the tariff impact and some of the other stuff going on. That's for flatbed specific.
But I feel like that also gives us a really good insight into like how costs have just increased, right? Because when we were going through the pandemic in general, I mean, we remember that one opportunity we were working on. I forget specifically where, but you were dealing with a flatbed opportunity. And I think we were seeing something like 900 loads per one truck or something that you've never seen before. Just that little hot spot. And of course, we needed to work in that one zone. Well, it's like, oh my God.
It's usually the case, right? Those are the challenges that we're at. Like anything else, the challenges for truck drivers, same as any business, right? Their costs are going up. Driver's wages and fuel account to about 60% of the overall expense. And then you have insurance is probably 15 to 20%. And then you got benefits, and then you got truck, maintenance and whatnot, payments. So yeah, the insurance piece is a big impact. The driver's wages is a big impact. Cost of equipment has gone up. So for most carriers, and especially throughout last year, they were, to get a load, their rates had to be very competitive, and so they were right on a razor thin margin. And so you saw and continue to see more exit of trucking companies from the market. Even with that said, there's I can't remember the figure, but there's a higher amount of entry into the market. It's new startups, typically small outfit, mom and pop owner operators coming in. They see an opportunity. They see high demand, let's say in the Southeast or coming out of the Laredo market, and they figure, hey, we can jump in here and make some money. And maybe not having the full perspective of what it takes to run a business profitably and sustain all the ups and downs. But so you have that churn, right? The constant cycle. But we are seeing more larger companies impacted in leaving the industry.
Yeah, it's funny. So we were, just as a little bit of background, we were chatting about this a little bit before. It really feels like where you're located right now is having a really big impact on how much you're struggling, right? Because like you're mentioning, some of these mom and pop companies popping up in the Southeast United States right now, there's just so much demand there. But I mean, that awesome heat map you showed me, which we'll send out to everybody, really shows that there's a location where trucking is doing great, and there's a lot of area where trucking is pretty neutral at this moment.
Yeah, and there's still, you still have the seasonal demands of produce, right? That hasn't gone away. Some of the produce that might have been exported or whatever, there might have been some shifts there, but still, as the produce growing season migrates across the U.S. up and down and left to right, that demand is still going to be there for the temp control and even the van market. And just to add, I mean, as another general point, we're talking a lot about truckload, but for the LTL market, for the people who ship a lot of LTL, we had the whole yellow closure. We had, a spike in prices from LTL carriers, worried about capacity, worried, last year about being able to sustain that throughout the year. And then we saw the reality of, well, the demand kind of leveled off and the current capacity in the market for LTL carriers was greater than that demand. So then all of a sudden the LTL carriers are saying, well, I don't have the freight going through my, now that surge and now it's gone. And now, my costs have gone up, just like anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not getting as much revenue per truck on my truck, but I need to continue to get freight. So now what we're seeing is we've got some companies that are holding the line on rate increases, and we have other companies coming to us for general rate increase, their annuals, and it's a balance. It's like, well, most of the carrier in the LTL world, their networks overlap, so there's always competition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if one guy needs an increase here and the other guy wants to hold a line, obviously you're probably going to ship more freight to them unless there's a service issue or some other thing. But so we're seeing a lot of that too in the LTL market now as we're going through the GRI season.
Yeah,
the rate increase season.
It's funny too, because I was just reading this article about how since Yellow's closure, LTL rates are up like roughly 12%. But just like what you said, but there's not more freight going through these networks at this point. They're down when it comes to freight utilization. And really good point too. How are they dealing with these little mini areas where it's two big players, right? And one goes for a rate increase and the other doesn't. How much can the other support holding the line if all the freight's going to shift, or most of the freight's going to shift? And how do companies like us, how do we manage our LTL strategy with this kind of weird changing environment?
Well, yeah, and what we do, how we kind of manage our LTL network is you always have the national players that have national coverage, the Old Dominions of the world, Estes, XPO, Best, and then you have the regional carriers that they could be a regional that has a pretty big footprint, like a Dayton Freight, in the Midwest. A company like AAA Cooper or Southwestern or Southeastern that have some overlap. And usually between those two, you can find a fit. Sometimes the service level needed days of transit and that kind of thing can kind of determine who you need to use depending on the requirements of the customer. But so that's how you kind of combat the increases, right? So if you have a lot of long haul LTL that needs direct service, meaning you don't want to have a carrier hand off to another carrier, you need one carrier to take it all the way through, and you need good transit time. Usually, like an Old Dominion or somebody like that is like the gold standard to service. And therefore, if they come in with a rate increase, it's harder to mitigate depending on what your customer requirements are and their service levels. So. But a lot of times we can mitigate with plugging other players in at a lower cost, similar service level, and playing that piece off. But again, all these guys have all have cost increases, right? Everybody does. It's just a matter of how much revenue they're getting, and a lot of times too, carriers have, especially LTL carriers, they'll have lanes where they make more money than other lanes, right? Mm-hmm. So lanes that they don't make a lot of money on, they're tend to hold their line on pricing or actually reduce pricing. And that comes into play with a lot of our carriers where we have what's called dynamic pricing. So when we go out, we could see a change in rates on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, just based on the demand and those lanes. And when times are busy and there's a lot of loads out there and capacity's tight, then the rates go up. Mm-hmm. And then we kind of lean back on our contractual rates that are held for at least a year without change. And when times are lean, when there's a lot of capacity out there, demand is down, then we can kind of flow more freight back into those rates. So,
Bob, excellent breakdown, because you're really talking about.
There's a lot of leverage.
You're right. How do we change your freight mix on live, quite frankly, to keep you competitive?
Right, and this is the game, not the game, but these are the services that the team behind the scenes, does when a client gives us their freight for a particular origin to destination, we don't just give it to one carrier and call it good and never look. We look across all our carriers and see, what's service-wise, is it meeting the needs? Rate-wise, is it most competitive? And then follow suit and kind of, keep an eye on it from there. So yeah, there's a lot of things that go into each shipment.
And I want to dive in real quick before I mention something else, because it's always fun when we have the opportunity to go into a newer market or a market we don't service as much, when we have an opportunity with enough volume, so we can go there and really start to evaluate what options are there. Let's build some carrier relationships, and let's kind of start this almost ingredient list of who we can pull from going forward. What's our staged approach to taking this new opportunity on? That can be just so exciting.
Yeah, and typically for truckload, it is kind of that piece, right? If you have, a market where we haven't had a lot of exposure to truckload lanes, we don't have a lot of partners built up there, then it's the taking that out, finding the partners through our tools, and then presenting them with the opportunity and building that relationship. And that's that piece there. If we look at how a smaller carrier kind of weathers the storm, and kind of what you said before, it's about being nimble enough to change. And if I have a good relationship here and then that dries up, can I pivot, go to another area, or rely on another let's say 3PL broker I'm working with to build another relationship that gives me continuous freight. And so diversification, typically on most of the larger carriers' parts, keeps them floating. When they start to lose that, they get siloed. Then, like you said, they get in trouble. So
they get on the outside of what's happening in the market in general.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, you mentioned about how we've got a lot of seasonality things that affect trucking, right? Agriculture was a big one you mentioned. But now we've also got these tariffs that are kind of creating these artificial huge shifts in trucking capacity, right? So, what we saw right in advance of the Mexico tariffs coming into effect, I call it Mexico because it was particularly Mexico, is a surge of northbound loads. And how does that, because, now we're dealing with kind of a staging of okay, now we've got these trucks going one direction mainly. And now we also have other seasonality. How does this affect rates in general? How does this kind of ripple through the market going forward? And, how does this just affect the market with these new random almost spikes in demand where it is one directional?
Well, yeah, and kind of like I mentioned before, it's, you have regions of the country where rates are going to be different based on the demand, right? And we're talking, let's say, the spot truckload market. So anything coming out of Laredo northbound is going to be a higher rate than, let's say, Midwest from Illinois to Pennsylvania or out east, something to that effect. So, and with demand dropping from our ports, Port of LA, Long Beach, we don't have the imports coming in, and the rates are going to drop coming out of California coming east. So yeah, it is kind of pocketed just based on where your business is. And spot rates usually, if they remain consistent one way or another, drive contractual rates at some point. But in this environment, it's so up and down. If tariffs stay and are mitigated and negotiated, and they stay off, and we start to see an import, and we probably will see an increase in demand, manufacturing. Things will start looking up, and then flow will come in, and we might get, by the end of the year, there might be more pressure, on rate increase because of demand is up, capacity is leaving the market or kind of stabilized. So then the carriers can start to charge more. So yeah, there's not one answer to fit everything. It's
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's the dilemma, right? I mean, so I want you to quick run through this for us. So you had some great visuals for us, and I really, really loved those. And you kind of talked about showing over the course of the past 12 months how we've seen just not capacity, but demand increase, but prices really not increase at the same pace. Do you think that's kind of from all of these start and stop situations? Like we had the East Coast strike, and then obviously we've got the tariffs going on. Do you think that's kind of part of it? Or what do you think is kind of factoring into that weakness in price increases, but also still having
Well,
areas?
yeah, and to kind of qualify, I mean, some of the data that I've been looking at and shared with you guys, sometimes the data is peanut buttered as a national average. So if you have a rate increase in one region and a rate decrease or staying flat in another, then it kind of
Levels
balances
itself
each
out a little
other out,
bit.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
So you can kind of get misled about, on a national average, where we've only seen a small increase, but in some regions it's up, double digits. So again, it kind of depends on where you're looking at and what region of the country. But
Yeah.
I think overall, um, from a national average, yes, rates have been kind of flat, even with the spikes, with the puts and takes in different regions of the country. And that still lends itself to the capacity out there, right? I guess you could say we're still kind of in a mild freight recession, coming off of continuing from last year, with the uncertainty. And the only way that gets solved is when there's no uncertainty and demand picks up, and then capacity tightens and rates go up.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
Okay.
truckload in particular, the truckload market is, what's a good word? It is so tied to supply and demand, out there with production and whatever is driving the demand in the U.S. But overall, I mean, as that goes up, the rates go up. It's a perfect economic equation, I guess.
It really, I think that's kind of the beautiful thing about being in our position. You really get to see that play out in so many different ways. Just that what's
Yeah.
going on with supply and demand, and like internationally, you obviously see the carriers really play with supply a lot, right? They'll blank all the time because they're really trying to manipulate that side of the equation. But it's different with trucking because it's not one big boat. It's a bunch of small trucks in different
Yeah.
locations. You can't just blank, quite frankly. So
Exactly.
okay, we've got time for one more, and and this is a really tough one, and you've really outlined
Save
why
the
this
tough
is
one
tough.
for last. All right, good.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Here's the deal: long-term strategy. If you're a company that relies on domestic shipping? What is your long-term strategy? What should you be looking out for? What should you expect? What are the next? Obviously it's really hard with the uncertainty around the tariffs, but from a 3-month perspective, what would be your expectations as a person reliant on the domestic shipping market?
Well, if we just talk in terms of I'm a truck load carrier and I have, let's say, less than 20 pieces of equipment. So I'm a small size owner here. And I've been moving for one client here or two clients. That's 90% of my business. I think, as I mentioned before, diversifying is probably going to be a way to weather this. You start to see a downtick with that client, you're going to have to maybe move to a different industry. Maybe you're posting and doing more regular routes, meaning, I know drivers like to have a route where they're home every night, only driving 500 miles or less a day and whatever. Half of your capacity or your trucks might have to go on the road and drive and go across the United States. They have multiple day routes where they can, either they have they're working the spot market and they go into some of these hot markets where there's a lot of demand and see if they can drive, some consistency out of that. And then also relationships, a relationship with a good 3PL, a broker that can feed loads into them, not necessarily relying on one client if it's a direct relationship or a broker that maybe doesn't have a big offering to have them. So having those good relationships, kind of talking through, hey, what can I use your equipment in? What lanes can we go to? I know we've been using the Midwest. Are you willing to go down to the Southeast? you're willing to do some long haul out west, East Coast, I've got an opportunity there. Those kind of conversations are very important, for both sides, both the broker and the small to medium sized carrier.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, I think you're making a great point right now, because you're right. The market's shifting in a way that flexibility is critical, really, for all the businesses in our industry at this moment, because people are looking for a different option. I think that's what the tariffs have caused, quite frankly. And that's what we're going to see when it turns out to where are loads present, who is, doing well economically, who is not. And you're right, for the smaller carriers, and I think your point about having the drivers that want to be home at night, that can be so tough when you're stuck in a market that doesn't have that capacity at that point.
And we're seeing examples here in West Michigan where, West Michigan's been tied to the office furniture industry for years. So the carriers here, the medium, the smaller carriers that were tied to the office furniture industry, and maybe that was, 80+% of their business, sales are down, and now, they're not getting the lanes. They're not, there's just not the revenue there for them anymore. So now they got to go out and diversify. And if they can't, we've seen them close. We've seen, a lot of West Michigan carriers close their doors.
Yeah.
That, there were stables in the community here for carrier capacity. So, which is sad, because, you hate to see them fail. And I've worked with some of these carriers, so
for years too. I mean, quite frankly, we started out as office furniture. So yeah, no, that's such a good point. Bob, okay, first of all, everyone, if you have not met Bob before, first of all, you got to give us a call. We got to talk about what's going on with your domestic. He's going to walk you through exactly what we can do for you guys, but mainly it's going to be just a really realistic approach and a staged approach. And I know everyone just heard that right now. So Bob, thank you so much. Thank you so much for breaking this down for us all.
Jason, it was my pleasure. I always get fired up when I talk to you.
Are you kidding me? So, you don't know this, but we've got you on next week too. So get ready for that.
Keep it rolling. Okay.
Exactly. We're just part 2. Bob, thank you. We're gonna be talking to Bob again soon, but everyone, make it a great week. Thanks all.
Take care, everyone.